the first report that the monitoring mission prepared on the human rights situation in Ukraine. Шановні пані і панове, вітаю вас в Українському кризовому медіа-центрі. Ми розпочинаємо серію прес-брифінгів. І зараз я запрошую до слова пана Армена Harutyunyana, главу моніторингової місії ООН з прав людини в Україні. Пан Harutyunyan представить четвертий звіт, підготовлений моніторинговою місією ООН з прав людини в Україні щодо ситуації з правами людини в Україні. Without any further ado, Mr. Harutyunyan, you're welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, dear colleagues and dear guests. First of all, at the start of my presentation, I would like to pay tribute to the 298 people who died in the crash of the Malaysian airline flights on 17 July, and also to all people who have died or been wounded in the fighting and violence in eastern Ukraine. This report documents the grave human rights abuses that have been committed by armed groups in eastern Ukraine during the reporting period of 8 June to 15 July. This includes abductions, detentions, torture, and executions that have been used to intimidate the population in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The report describes the total breakdown of law and order and the reign of fear and terror that exists in those areas under control of the armed groups. It insists that more be done to protect the lives of innocent people and to bring the perpetrators to account. The report describes the total breakdown of the law in these regions. The report describes the rapid escalation of hostilities that has been occurred in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, especially since the end of the 10-day ceasefire on 30 June. And President Poroshenko said he was ready to restore the ceasefire on 3 conditions. All hostages should be released, restoration of governmental control over the border with the Russian Federation, and armed groups should be disarmed. The report notes the professionalization of the armed groups, who are increasingly well organized and well equipped militarily. It describes the loss of lives and the heavy damage to property and infrastructure as a result of the heavy fighting that is located in and around population centers. It reminds both sides of the need to act proportionally and to take precautions to avoid the deaths and injury of civilians. Report noting this is particularly important in an environment in which armed groups and civilians are intermingled. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission, together with the World Health Organization, estimate that as of 26 July, more than 1,129 people have been killed in the East, including civilians, the military, and members of the armed groups, since mid-April when the fighting began. And more than 3,442 have been wounded. It reminds that as the government regains territory formerly controlled by the armed groups, it must ensure the full application of international human rights norms and guarantees, including avoiding reprisals when identifying those suspected of having violated the law. The report documents the plight of the thousands of internally displaced people who continue to flee the fighting in the East, in addition to those who continue to leave Crimea, and it makes recommendations to the government to address the outstanding issues. Currently, there are 101,670 internally displaced persons in Ukraine, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. This is an increase of more than 15,000 IDPs in the 2 weeks since the report was written. The report also assesses the current situation in Crimea, where harassment and discrimination has intensified against Ukrainian nationals, Crimean Tatars, representatives of religious minorities, minority groups in general, and activists who opposed the 16 March referendum in Crimea. You will recall that this referendum was declared as having no validity by the United Nations General Assembly in its resolution 68-262 of 27 March. Currently, the United Nations Refugee Agency estimates that more than 14,000 people have left Crimea. The report examines the ability of Ukrainians to exercise their freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly, movement, and religion or belief, as well as their political rights. In this regard, it notes some worrying trends concerning the rise of hate speech, particularly in social media, and the number of incidents targeting Russian-owned banks and businesses on the ground that they are financing terrorism. Freedom of expression has also come under attack, especially in the East, in the territory under the control of armed groups, where attempts at media manipulation have been especially egregious. But it also notes some trends in other parts of Ukraine where there have been attempts, so far not too many, of attempts to muzzle the press. This report reviews some of the issues of minorities and other groups facing discrimination, noting that more could be done to ensure inclusivity and equal participation in all public affairs and political life. In terms of economic and social rights, the report notes that the current economic recession, coupled with the increasing expense of the security operation in the East, and the cost of rebuilding and extensive damage to property and infrastructure will have is a profound impact on the whole country. The report notes that the situation on the East is dire. This is the country's center for heavy industry, and there has been severe disruption to mines, factories, businesses, and big industrial enterprises. It reviews the lack of progress reported on the investigations into the violence around the Maidan protests and into the 2nd May Odessa incident. The report discusses new legislation being introduced as part of the government's reform and recommends additional actions that should be taken to address corruption and other systemic problems. It recommends that the constitutional changes proposed by the President that were published on 2nd July be widely and inclusively discussed before being adopted by the Parliament. To facilitate this report suggests that these important constitutional changes be made available in minority languages such as Russian. The important role of civil society is noted in the report, describing how citizens, both individually and in groups, have stepped in where their government has been unable to respond quickly enough. Civilians have assisted each other in the East, they have accommodated people fleeing the fighting, and they have even provided support and equipment to the armed forces. And perhaps this new civic spirit will help drive the next phase of the much-needed change in Ukraine. And finally, the report recommends the need to develop a multi-year human rights national plan of action for Ukraine based on the recommendations of the United Nations human rights mechanisms and the work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine here. Thank you. Let me to finish at this stage, and we are at your disposal to be asked questions, but before that, let me to introduce you and to invite here my deputy head of our mission, Fiona Fraser.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harutyunyan. Your colleagues have questions, please.
Jan Paluka, German Radio. I would like to know what has changed since the last report on human rights situation that was issued, I think, 3 weeks ago.
You know that we are issuing public reports each month, and of course the situation is changed very quickly. In this report, particularly in executive summary, mostly we focused on the impact of the situation in East on the rest part of the country, because it is limiting ability of the government to address systemic human rights issues and in some sense deepening the economical recession. So from this point of view, the impact of the situation in the East has been increased, and this is maybe the main trends for last month.
David Hirschman with the
New York Times, you spoke about the large increase in the number of IDPs. Can you give a more finely graded analysis? Are they fleeing voluntarily? Are these people being forcibly removed from where they live? Can you talk about what reasons you're seeing for that movement? And to the extent that you can pinpoint where people are moving from and toward, are more within Ukraine? Are they leaving, crossing into Russia? What can you tell us about those IDPs, please?
Yes, thank you. Fiona, maybe you will ask this question.
I think as the fighting has escalated over the past weeks, what we and our other UN agencies and partners have seen is, yes, an escalation of people trying to flee the fighting. Initially, I think we saw people trying to flee the violence that was being meted out to them by the armed groups. And it's not clear, it still remains unclear how many people remain displaced within the actual regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. But as we all see, there's movement into Ukraine. There are reports of movement also into the Russian Federation. But there are also reports of return taking place to, for example, Slavyansk.
And in some sense, in report, we are reflecting these new trends. We are envisaging, in some sense, new wave of IDPs from Crimea, taking into account the situation there.
Do we have more questions, please? You named a number of...
Кількість людей, які постраждали, які були вбиті. Яким чином ви отримуєте?
So we are using different sources for this, and of course we are closely cooperating with national institutions. We have monitors on the ground, and some information we are receiving from first-hand resources. And our main partner in regard of the numbers, World Health Organization, which are helping us in this. And after verifying these numbers, of course, very difficult to say that this is a precise number. That's why I would say, I would add to that number which I have given you, that at least we have this number, at least. Fiona, if you have something to add.
You mentioned that there were executions taking place within the armed groups. How serious is that? Do you have examples of that? And my other question is are there a lot of civilian casualties resulting from the Ukrainian military's operation in the east?
So we have the documentation on this, and in regard of details, I would ask Fiona to present you our information.
So on the first point with regard to the documentation on executions instructed by the arms group, yes, we have evidence of 4 cases, and we have been spoken to relatives or witnesses or victims in this area. With regard to the number of civilian casualties, as we all know, it's very difficult to actually, and as Armen has said, very difficult to actually get a full picture of exactly the amount of number of civilian casualties. But you can see from the figures that they are increasing. It's not clear exactly for what reason, but we understand from sources on the ground and our colleagues that the civilian casualties are increasing due to the fighting that's taking place.
The problem is, and the report is distributed, and you can to go into the details in report. That's the one issue that the problem is that armed groups, they are placing themselves among populated zones, and it is bringing the increase of the number of the casualties. This is one of the main reasons, and the other details you can find in our report.
Ms. Harutyunyan, just to complete this question of the clip before, the organization Human Rights Watch released the data of the 16 people, civilians who have been killed in Donetsk by the pro-government Ukrainian forces. Do you have any comments on that? Do you have any information of that?
So, frankly said, we don't have very concrete information on this. And Fiona, if you...
Because you mentioned specifically in your reports about the heavy losses and losses of life and property and infrastructure as a consequence of the heavy fighting located by the protesters.
Yes, but we have to take into account that sometimes why in report we are not blaming when we don't have a first-hand resources on one side, just we are reflecting fact that civilians, because it is very difficult to understand where from. I said that these armed groups, they are placing themselves in very populated zones, and it is bringing, they're causing a lot of such impacts. But to say that it is because of Ukrainian forces, we refrain to make such conclusions. That's we are putting in the report just facts. And Fiona, if you have something to add to this.
Just really to add that, I mean, like many others, the protection of the civilians, particularly as the escalation of fighting, is absolutely essential to all those who are taking part in the fighting.
This is what always stands the National Security and the Defense Council. They stress that Ukrainian armed forces do not hit fire at civilians. Thank you so much. We have another question from the second row.
Скажіть, будь ласка, ви рекомендували українському уряду...
You recommended to the Ukrainian government to address the issue of... Can you ask in Russian? You were saying in your report that there are questions of addressing the crimes during Maidan, that the state should pay attention to that and should resolve that issue. That is the issue of Maidan, that is about Odessa, that is about different events, and basically that is one of the key issues in our mandate. We were in our previous reports also mentioning the issues of Maidan, talking about the current investigation. In this report, we're just stating the fact that the investigation is still going on, it's delayed, and people are still waiting, and you know that when it is also transparent and when those who are guilty are punished, then that leads to basically the escalation of the situation. And that is true not only about Maidan in Kiev, but about Odessa events. So we're just reporting.
Watch, as you surely know, has issued a report saying that Ukrainian government forces have killed more than 15 civilians with ground rocket attacks. And they have also said that the use of unguided rockets by both insurgents and the government is a violation of international and humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. Could you comment on that?
So, sorry, but it is a repetition of the question.
Exactly the question I've asked before.
Just one more time I can repeat that. We are reflecting on the facts, and for us the fact is, which is bringing more and more casualties among civilians, that these armed groups placing themselves among populated zones.
Thank you so much.
Saber Ayers from the Christian Science Monitor. When you say armed groups, are you including armed groups from both sides?
No. In our report, this terminology, armed groups, we are using just in regard of the armed groups in Donetsk, so-called Donetsk, and Luhansk People Republics, so-called. So we don't mean under the armed groups Ukrainian forces.
What about the armed groups? What about the sort of volunteer battalions?
We are using in report, and you can find it just the battalions.
Do we have any more questions, colleagues? We do not have questions. Mr. Harutyunyan, thank you so much for presenting this report, and we are looking forward the improving of the situation on the human rights in Ukraine, and your new reports witnessing this improvement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be aware that we have an opportunity to host here right now the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia. So please stay on your seats, and we hope that he will make it up to us within the 10 minutes.